Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing well. In my last video, I went through a box of over 40-year-old art supplies that my dad had given me to go through. I ended up getting a ton of requests on that video for me to try creating a piece of art using the supplies, so that's exactly what we're doing today. One of the most exciting finds were these Winsor & Newton watercolors. I use this line of paints quite a lot, so I was very interested to see what 40 plus years would possibly do to the paints. I've never tried using any of these particular tubes, so I figured a good place to start would be to create a bit of a mini palette with all of the colors. First, I looked up Winsor & Newton's current watercolor range to get all of these paints into color order. They actually still make all but one of these colors. Not entirely sure what happened to that one, it might have just been renamed. Once I had all of the paints lined up in color order, it was time to start trying to open them, which was fun. It started off reasonably okay. The first couple of tubes could have their caps removed with the help of some pliers, and the paint within, although very thick, could still be squeezed out, even if it took a lot of pressure on the tube to do so. And then it kind of started to go downhill from there. Some tubes were just fully dried out and the paint was rock solid inside. Others still felt squishy in places but wouldn't squeeze out of the tube, and so on and so forth. Some actually felt pretty much brand new though, as far as how easy they were to open and the consistency of paint from the tube, which was kind of crazy, but I did end up having to go back to some of the more problematic tubes and get creative as to how to extract some of the paint from them. But I did end up making it work out and got a bit of each paint color onto the palette. Next, I wanted to swatch all of the colors so that I knew exactly what I was working with. There actually ended up being a nice range of colors to make up a good small palette. The exact colors were cadmium yellow pale, scarlet vermilion, which was actually the one color that they don't make anymore or renamed, cadmium red, alizarin crimson, French ultramarine, cobalt blue, Prussian blue, viridian, hooker's green dark, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, burnt umber, and black. So yeah, a really good basic set of colors. If you haven't seen my other video, basically all of these supplies were pretty much bought for university from my dad. He is an architect, so these were from his school days, and both of us feel like this was possibly like a class list or something that he had to buy, because this is a very balanced out set, considering like it's really typical for the colors in terms of the like 12 sets you would see now and stuff. You would see a lot of this sort of color loadout in those as well. Now for testing these old art supplies out, I wanted to try and make it as authentic as possible. There are quite a lot of different supplies in that box, and I didn't just want to use the watercolor paints. I managed to revive one of the Rapidograph pens back to working order, and I also grabbed a couple of other pens that still work to possibly use for line art. One of the other incredible finds were these Winsor & Newton Series 7 brushes, so I grabbed those to use exclusively for the paint as well. Something that wasn't ever part of the supplies found were drawing surfaces. So again, to keep it as authentic to the same time period as possible, I decided to use this Arches paper that I had lying around my studio. I figured it was the safest bet in terms of watercolor paper available then, that also probably hadn't changed in quality or consistency, paper recipe, whatever. I'm sure you understand what I'm getting at. Now, originally I had like no clue what I wanted to try and use these art supplies on. Originally I thought maybe I would do some fan art from a movie or something from around the same vague time period, but then I watched Ratchet and I just kind of felt like doing some Ratchet fan art, so that's what I went with, which I feel like if I don't explicitly state that this is definitely not the same time period as the art supplies, I'm gonna get disowned, so there's that disclaimer. But this idea did end up working out because this was a very natural idea for me that if I wasn't doing like a specific art supplies try test sort of thing, I would have just done with my usual favorites. So I normally, when I'm testing out particular art supplies, I like to try and do something that I would normally be working on, like not really try and skew something towards maybe like that particular challenge that those particular particular supplies might entail. So this was a great fit because it gave me a really natural test for me to try out these older supplies on. So the vague plan for this piece, which I'm sure you can see taking shape here, was to have a much more realistic portrait in the front in terms of color scheme, and then a more surrealistic stylized background that also has this sort of portrait hidden within it. As far as the art supplies that I'm using go, if you know me and have been watching my videos for a while, you will probably know that I'm quite a large fan of larger color selections in terms of my art supplies. I love a good large watercolor palette with a lot of color range, so going from my usual, like, however many colors I'm used to having at my disposal, like, obviously I'm not using all of them for every single painting, but I do have a large color selection to kind of choose which colors I want to work off of. So going from that to something, I think it's like 15 colors in the palette that I'm using now, which definitely is still like a decent size palette that's like small to medium size, I would say, like definitely not the smallest watercolor palette a lot of people would use, but a lot smaller than I'm used to, so I was mixing a lot. And it's not like I don't mix paints when I have a larger color selection, but for this one I was definitely noticing that I was just fully coming up with the in-between colors that this palette did not afford me, which was a nice challenge. It was nice to be reminded that I could actually downsize my color selection and still be able to mix the colors that I need. But that was something that I was really nervous about, because obviously I have gotten used to using my main watercolor palette and I guess the color recipes that I'm used to mixing up when I need, you know, a nice shadow color for a lighter skin tone or just the general skin tone color. As far as the paint itself goes, even though they are like 40-year-old paint tubes, I really didn't notice that much difference when working with them, which isn't entirely surprising. I mean, they were a lot harder to get out of the tubes than they were to actually work with. But I feel like if any paint type would withstand the test of time as far as usability goes over time, watercolor would be it. Even though I have current Winsor & Newton professional colors in my collection, I don't actually have any of the colors that were part of these older tubes, so I don't actually have any like one-to-one comparison to be able to give to you in terms of the color payoff and whatnot to see if that maybe deteriorates over time. But I will say, just from even looking at the swatch sheet afterwards, they do remind me a lot of the Winsor & Newton Cotman colors, which the Cotman paints are incredible, and I used them for many, many years before sort of fully upgrading my entire watercolor set. But the Cotman paints are still student grade and therefore don't have some of the actual minerals in them and are instead made with dyes and stuff. And these paints definitely, like the cadmium, should have the cadmiums in them. So yeah, that's just something I wanted to mention. I guess it's sort of strange that an older professional watercolor paint reminds me more of a current day student grade paint. I am generally mostly using Daniel Smith now, and I know all watercolor brands have different compounds, so it could just be that Winsor & Newton sort of has this, I guess, less granulation based thing. Not that any of these particular colors that I was using should have a ton of granulation. I guess it's just that some of them were a lot less saturated color-wise than I guess I'm sort of used to within that same color. And not that these paints don't have good color payoff, I just noticed that some of the colors I was expecting to be a little more rich and pigmented. The brushes are of course impeccable. I have been using the Series 7 brushes for quite a while now, like ever since my dad did find his original sable brushes. I have been using them and they got me hooked on the Series 7 brushes, so I have been more used to using those. And before I had tried them out, I of course thought they were overpriced, overhyped, but when you use them, there's just something so addictive to these brushes. They hold so much water and pigment, but they still keep their point perfectly, and you can just get such a range of detail for each size. Like for the majority of this entire painting, I was using a size 6 and a size 2. I only busted out the size 0 for the really fine detail in the smaller portrait. And even then, that portrait is so small, if I wasn't using a Series 7 brush, I could have easily started going into the multiple 0 brushes and still possibly had some difficulties achieving that level of detail in the face. On a bit of a side note / tangent, now that the front portrait's outfit is more painted, I missed having indigo so badly for this painting. I mean, I did manage to mix up something that worked well, but I mean, having to mix up indigo, which is one of normally my most used colors, nearly killed me. And that would be the one part of this painting that I don't think I quite nailed. Like, I would love to be able to swap that bottom part out and repaint it in my lovely Daniel Smith indigo paint. For this green background design area, I guess you could call it, I left it for, one of the later things to work on because I was going back and forth a bit style-wise. At one point I had it that it was pretty much just going to be like a silhouette or a more minimalistic version of this side figure, like maybe leave some idea of like separation of, oh, the hair is here, her outfit starts here, but don't have facial features and leave it pretty minimalistic. But I decided that I did want to actually put the facial features on this and just leave it the monochrome green. At one point I sort of giving there a hint of the actual colors, but just sort of having that green overlay like a lot of the promo pictures had for this show. And let me tell you, I took my sweet time on this portrait because it is tiny. Like, I wish I had scaled up this drawing more than I did. This was on slightly larger paper, which thankfully I decided to go with something larger so I could get in more detail, but I did still have a decent amount of room that I could have possibly cut down the sort of splashy areas a bit and had a little bit of an easier time if at least, if the overall image was larger, then this back section would have been larger and it wouldn't have caused such grief in the face because it was tiny. And I know that the Arches paper was not exactly part of the 40-year-old art supplies, but I did want to talk about it because I have somewhat infamously publicly dunked on Arches paper because I do not like it. And this was actually done on the back side of the cold pressed Arches watercolor paper because the last time that I used the front side, I just did not like the texture and I just really did not want to set myself up for something that I felt was not going to turn out or look the way I wanted. I just find that it's way too textured. It's not that I don't like 100% cotton paper because I do really like some kinds, but Arches is just not my jam. At some point I will muster up the courage to use the front side again and see if my opinion has changed, but I did want to mention that this was the back side, which is a lot smoother of a texture, and it didn't fight me as much, so I guess that was a good choice on my part. Though I will say, I did notice that this paper did buckle quite a lot considering the quality that this paper should be, and also trying to lift color on this thing was an absolute nightmare. It just sunk completely into the paper, which some people might like, but I was trying to lift some certain areas to modify things and it just was not happening. Now onto the line art side of things. Like I mentioned, I did manage to get one of these Rapidograph pens working again. Mostly it's getting the actual tips back into working order, which Most of the smaller tipped ones that my dad had were just like beyond help. They had, 40 years of dried up ink in them, and I just could not get them working again. But this one was the smallest nib one that I could get working, and that was like, I believe it was labeled as 0.5. I would assume millimeters. It definitely seemed along the lines of that thickness, but these pens have almost no line width variation, so I decided to leave the line art for last because I wasn't actually sure how much line art I wanted within this illustration, and I also didn't know as terms of the other pens that I knew I was probably going to have to use for some of the smaller areas. I was not going to bet their waterproofness on this painting, so did the line art last, which worked out well. It is pretty minimal though, and you can almost not see it, so I'm not entirely sure how effective it was. It definitely, gave some areas some nice edges, and I did want to use more than just the watercolor paints and brushes in this illustration to try out a few more of the older art supplies that were in that original box. Yeah, overall I had a lot of fun testing out these older art supplies. I really like how this painting turned out, and it's super cool to now look at this painting and think that it was created using these like 40-year-old art supplies. And yeah, that is everything. Thank you for joining me as I tested these supplies out, and I will see you in my next video.